In 1944, a train pulls into Auschwitz. A psychiatrist steps onto the platform. He's been working for years on a manuscript, a book he believes could change how people understand the human mind. It's sewn into the lining of his coat. Within hours, the coat is gone. The manuscript is gone. His wife, his mother, his brother, gone. He has nothing left but his name, and they take that too and replace it with a number. The question this man spent the next 3 years answering, not in the library, not in a lecture hall, but inside the worst laboratory imaginable, was this. When everything is taken from a person, what remains? His name was Viktor Frankl, and what he discovered in those camps didn't just help him survive. It became one of the most important ideas in the history of psychology. Here's what's strange about this book. It's not a self-help book. It's not a memoir. It's not even really a book about the Holocaust. It's a book about a question that is just as alive for someone sitting in a comfortable apartment in 2026, feeling quietly empty as it was for a prisoner in Auschwitz in 1944. Why do some people fall apart when life gets hard, and others find something inside them that holds? Frankl's answer surprised me. Honestly, it still does every time I think about it. We're talking about Man's Search for Meaning, published in German in 1946, and the original title is actually way more raw than the English version. It translates closer to a psychologist experiences the concentration camp, or sometimes, say yes to life in spite of everything. The scale of this book's impact is almost hard to wrap your head around. Over 16 million copies sold, translated into more than 50 languages. The Library of Congress named it one of the 10 most influential books in America. It completely reshaped existential psychology. But here's the thing. You can't start with the clinical data to understand why this book matters so much. You have to start in the mud. You have to start in the crucible where the theory was actually forged, because before Frankl was a best-selling author, he was prisoner number 119,104. Between 1942 and 1945, he was moved through 4 different camps, including Auschwitz and a particularly brutal detachment of Dachau called Kaufering III. And the system he was thrust into wasn't just designed to kill people physically, it was meticulously engineered to annihilate the human spirit. The moment you arrived, the person you were simply ceased to exist. They shaved every inch of hair. They took every photograph, every wedding ring. Frankl describes this almost grimly surreal realization that they literally possess nothing but their own naked bodies. The baseline of existence was absolute zero, which sets up what I think is the most haunting psychological observation I've ever come across. If you asked any biologist or evolutionary psychologist who would survive longest in a starvation-level forced labor camp, the answer seems obvious, right? The biggest, the toughest, survival of the fittest in its most literal biological sense. That's the logical assumption. But Frankl, watching all of this as a trained psychiatrist, noticed a profound anomaly. Physical robustness was not the primary predictor of survival. Time and again, he watched the strongest prisoners collapse. While physically frail, delicate individuals somehow kept going. The size of your muscles didn't save you. What saved people? And this is really the foundational pillar of his entire philosophy, was what he called a deep inner spiritual freedom. I want to sit with that for a second, because it defies every basic animal instinct. So what does inner spiritual freedom even mean? It means possessing a why. Frankl anchored his entire psychology of survival to a single line from Nietzsche. He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how. And he observed that the exact moment a prisoner lost their why, their reason for existing, their body would almost immediately follow. It was biologically lethal. A prisoner would wake up, refuse to move, refuse to eat, and just wait for the end. No threats could reach them. The light had gone out. So here's Frankl, a doctor with no medicine. His only intervention was to try and manufacture a why. He called it weaving the slender threads of a broken life into a firm pattern. He reminded one man that his child was waiting. He reminded an author that his book series was unfinished. He convinced them that life still expected something from them. And now let's talk about Frankl's own threads, because the way he kept himself alive is astonishing. When they took that coat, he didn't just let his work disappear. He found stolen scraps of paper and reconstruct his theories in shorthand. Just enough to hold on to the ideas. He also used something he called intensive visualization. When the reality became too much, he would forcefully detach his mind from the present. He'd picture himself standing in a warm lecture hall after the war. He'd feel the podium, see the faces, and he'd imagine giving a lecture on the psychology of the camp. He took the suffering he was living through and transmuted it into the material for his future work. He made the suffering useful. And then there was the personal. He clung to the mental image of his wife, Tilly. He didn't even know if she was still alive. She wasn't. She died in Bergen-Belsen. But he came to realize that the truth of her biological existence didn't actually matter to what she gave him. The love itself was the anchor. He witnessed prisoners who, despite being starving themselves, would walk through the huts comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. Think about that. That, Frankl said, is the ultimate proof that we are not just biological machines reacting to stimuli. You can take everything, but you cannot take away my choice. That freedom, that last, inalienable freedom, is where everything he believed begins. Frankl's conclusion is deceptively simple. Everything can be taken from a human being, but one thing. The last of the human freedoms, to choose your attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose your own way. You don't control the guards, you don't control the weather, you don't control the rations, but you retain absolute sovereignty over your response to those things. Now, I want to push back on this, because there's a modern lens we have to look at this through. When I hear, choose your attitude, a skeptical part of my brain immediately flags it as the 1940s version of toxic positivity. Is he essentially saying, hey, just think positive thoughts, focus on the bright side, and the camp won't be so bad? Because if so, that's not just wrong. It's insulting to the reality of what those people were living through. Frankl despised what we'd now call toxic positivity. The reality of a concentration camp is horrific, and pretending otherwise isn't a strategy, it's a delusion. Think of it this way. Imagine you've been dropped into the middle of a freezing ocean during a storm. You cannot positive think the water into being warm. The water is freezing. But you absolutely can choose whether you're going to tread water and paddle toward a shore, or whether you're going to stop and let yourself sink. The water is the stimulus. The decision to paddle is the response. And in that gap between the freezing water and what your body does next, there is a gap. And in that gap lies your freedom. Logotherapy doesn't ask you to lie to yourself about how cold the water is. It asks you to look the brutal, freezing reality dead in the eye, accept that it is terrible, and then take total responsibility for how you carry yourself within it. That's not toxic positivity, that's the opposite. And this mechanism is the core engine of the human mind itself, which brings us to his theory. Frankl develops what he calls logotherapy, which becomes known as the Third Viennese School of Psychotherapy. And to understand why that matters, you need to know a little about Vienna in the early 20th century, because it was the undisputed capital of the human mind. The first Viennese school was Sigmund Freud, and Freud's entire framework was built on what he called the will to pleasure. Strip away civilization, and human beings are just sophisticated animals driven by base instincts, maximizing pleasure, minimizing pain, naked self-interest all the way down. Then came the second Viennese school, Alfred Adler. Adler looked at human behavior and argued that we're driven by the will to power. We're fundamentally striving for superiority, trying to overcome our innate feelings of inferiority. Life is a dominance hierarchy, and we're all just trying to climb our respective ladders. And then Frankl, having survived the ultimate stress test of human nature, steps up and says to both of them, "You're missing the primary engine." He introduces the will to meaning, logos being the Greek word for meaning, and his argument is that meaning is the primary baseline motivation of a human life. And his evidence is the camp itself. If Freud were right, if we're only driven by pleasure, then the moment the SS took away all comfort, civilization should have collapsed instantly. Everyone should have become an animal fighting for scraps, and some did. But if Freud's rule were absolute, nobody would ever give away their last piece of bread. If Adler were right, if we only care about power and status, why would a frail prisoner sacrifice their own safety to comfort a dying stranger who has zero power to offer in return? Frankl proved that humans will willingly sacrifice pleasure and endure horrific pain if they believe it serves a transcendent purpose. That is not a small claim. That is a complete rewriting of what we think human beings fundamentally are. Now here's what I find remarkable. Frankl is writing this in the mid-1940s, based entirely on clinical observation and philosophy. Decades later, modern neuroscience essentially maps his exact theory onto the human brain. Neurobiology distinguishes between two types of well-being, hedonic and eudaimonic. Hedonic well-being is Freud's will to pleasure. It's the dopamine hit. You buy a new car, get a promotion, eat an incredible meal, your brain lights up. But then the buzz fades. That's the hedonic treadmill. It requires constant escalation just to avoid withdrawal. Eudaimonic well-being is different. It's the neurobiological reward of living purposefully, the will to meaning. When you're doing work that genuinely matters to you, your brain produces a far more durable cocktail of neurochemicals. Think of it as the difference between cotton candy and a real meal. The will to pleasure is cotton candy. Massive immediate rush, tastes incredible for about 5 seconds, completely unsustainable. The will to meaning is a dense, protein-rich meal. It doesn't give you a sugar high, but it provides a slow, sustained burn that actually builds something and keeps you going for miles. That is the biological reality Frankl anticipated, which leads to a genuinely terrifying question. If meaning is our primary drive, what happens when that drive is starved? Frankl shifted his focus to a psychological epidemic he saw spreading, the existential vacuum. The first loss is biological. As we evolved, we lost the rigid animal instincts that used to dictate what we must do. A bird doesn't have an existential crisis about its career. Humans lost that hardwiring. We are burdened with choice. The second loss is culture. For centuries, we had rigid traditions telling us what we should do. But in the 21st century, we dismantled those traditions. The side effect is that we are left floating. No instincts, no traditions. Frankl says we either do what everyone else is doing, conformism, or we do what everyone else wants us to do. We fill the void with money, status, or endless entertainment, but the vacuum remains. And he observed one specific symptom, Sunday neurosis, that wave of depression that hits when the noise of the work week stops. Sunday afternoon arrives, the inbox empties, and suddenly you are alone with yourself. Think about closing your laptop on a Friday. You're exhausted, you sink into the couch and start scrolling. Short-form videos, one after another, 3 hours pass. You weren't even enjoying it, you were just swiping. And when you finally lock the screen and the room goes dark, there it is, that crushing, suffocating wave. The unsettling realization that you are alone with yourself and there is nothing substantial holding you up. That dread is the existential vacuum. And when people can't bear it, Frankl observed they fall into the tragic triad, depression, aggression, and addiction. Addiction especially as a frantic attempt to numb the emptiness. If you can't find meaning, you reach for distraction. What Frankl identified is what he called nogenic neurosis. Not from repressed trauma or chemical imbalance, but from the existential frustration of the human spirit, from a life that lacks meaning. Maybe you have the 6-figure job and the nice apartment, and you still think, is this really it? Frankl's answer is that the vacuum becomes visible once material needs are met. This pain isn't a pathology to be medicated away. It's a signal. Frankl identified the central paradox. The direct pursuit of happiness causes unhappiness. The more single-mindedly you chase happiness as a goal, the more it eludes you. The act of trying to be happy makes you miserable. Happiness cannot be pursued directly. It has to be a byproduct. It happens naturally when you dedicate yourself to something greater than yourself. You aim at meaning, and happiness catches you by surprise along the way. So, if we can't chase happiness directly, what's the actual mechanism for finding meaning? Frankl isn't just a philosopher. He gives you a map. And this map has 3 pathways. The first pathway is creative values, finding meaning through doing, through contributing something. It's about contribution, not prestige. The size of the act is irrelevant. The direction, outward, giving, that's what matters. The second pathway is experiential values, finding meaning by deeply encountering something or someone, experiencing truth, beauty, nature, or loving another human being deeply. Simply by witnessing the beauty of the world, you are meaning-making. And the highest form of this is love. Love isn't just an emotion, it's an epistemological tool, a way of knowing. It allows you to see the dormant potential in someone else, and by loving them, you help them actualize it. The third pathway is attitudinal values, finding meaning in how you face unavoidable suffering. This is the belief that meaning can be extracted even from the bleakest moments, through the dignity and courage with which you carry your burden. But be precise. Frankl does not celebrate suffering. Suffering is only meaningful when it is unavoidable. If you can change the situation, your duty is to change it. Attitudinal values only apply when the suffering is truly inescapable. You cannot rely on just one. Meaning isn't a single thread. It's a pattern, and it requires all three pathways working in concert. A person who ignores experiential or attitudinal values feels empty despite their achievements. In logotherapy, the patient sits upright, but must hear things that are sometimes very disagreeable to hear. The therapist is going to actively confront you with the reality of your life's choices. Psychoanalysis is retrospective. It digs backwards through early childhood, repressed conflicts, and unconscious wounds to explain why you are the way you are. Logotherapy is fundamentally forward-looking. It asks not what happened to you, but what is waiting to be fulfilled by you. And to help patients break through the neurosis blocking that path, Frankl developed some highly specific and deeply counterintuitive clinical techniques. The first one is called paradoxical intention, and on the surface it sounds like genuinely terrible advice. Here's how it works. Take anticipatory anxiety, one of the most vicious feedback loops in clinical psychology. Say a patient is terrified of sweating in public, they have a presentation coming up, they start worrying about sweating. The brain's amygdala reads that worry as a threat and triggers fight or flight. And the physiological result of fight or flight? Sweating. The patient feels themselves sweating, which confirms the fear, which increases the panic until they're having a full-blown panic attack. The standard advice is, calm down, try to relax, think positive, which, as anyone who has experienced this will tell you, makes it significantly worse. Frankl's technique goes in the exact opposite direction. So what does the logotherapist actually do with the sweating patient? They tell the patient to go into the social situation and intentionally try to sweat as much as humanly possible, to actively wish for the very thing they fear. The therapist says, go up to that podium and say to yourself, I usually only sweat a quart, but today I'm going to pour out 10 gallons. By intentionally trying to bring about the feared event, and crucially, by bringing humor to it, the patient short-circuits the amygdala's fear response. You cannot simultaneously be terrified of an involuntary bodily reaction while actively, humorously trying to force it to happen. The two states cancel each other out. The hyperintention is broken, and suddenly the patient finds they can't sweat at all. This leads directly to the second technique, dereflection. Dereflection addresses a different kind of loop, the hyperreflective patient, the person who is completely obsessed with monitoring their own internal state. Think about what happens when you can't sleep. You're lying in bed hyper-focusing on the act of falling asleep. Am I asleep yet? Why aren't I asleep? The harder you try, the more awake you become. The only way you actually drift off is by releasing that focus. You stop aiming at sleep, and then it arrives on its own. That is the exact mechanism of dereflection. The therapist shifts the patient's focus away from their own internal neurosis and points it outward toward a meaningful goal. The moment you direct your energy outward, toward a cause, toward another person, the symptoms of the existential vacuum begin to atrophy and die. It's an empowering theory, but an idea this powerful cannot be taken on faith alone. We need to look at the shadows. The loudest critique comes not from psychologists, but from Holocaust scholars, and it goes directly to the heart of the book's central claim. If Frankl argues survival was a matter of inner spiritual freedom, of choosing the right attitude, then what does that imply about the millions who didn't survive? The uncomfortable corollary is this, that those who were murdered simply gave up. It risks framing the Holocaust through a lens of victim blaming. Scholar Lawrence Langer's point is blunt. A bullet to the back of the head does not care about your inner spiritual freedom. A selection for the gas chamber is not thwarted by a why. The Nazi extermination machine was not a psychological test. It was industrialized murder, and attributing survival to attitude almost entirely erases that brutal reality. Langer suggests that finding meaning in suffering could be perversely mapped onto Nazi ideology itself. The sign above the gates read, Arbeit macht frei, work sets you free. It is a critique that forces us to confront the real limits of psychology in the face of systemic, industrialized evil. There's also what historians call the Auschwitz discrepancy. The book anchors itself there, but historical records indicate Frankl was held there only briefly. Records indicate he was transferred to Kaufering III, a subcamp of Dachau, after only a matter of days in a depot area at Auschwitz. To be absolutely clear, Kaufering III was a nightmare of forced labor, starvation, and typhus. Frankl unquestionably experienced the horrors of the camp system, but the specific framing of his narrative, the way it leans so heavily into the cultural weight of Auschwitz, has been questioned by historians. And historian Timothy Pytel notes something that cuts even deeper. Frankl's account of his own theory shifted over time. In some interviews, he claimed the camps gave birth to logotherapy. In other writings, he stated the camps merely tested a theory he had already fully developed in the 1930s. That distinction matters enormously. If logotherapy was a pre-existing theory he was validating, rather than a revelation forged in the mud, it fundamentally changes how we view the objectivity of his observations. He may have been looking for confirmation of ideas he already held, but the darkest controversy in the literature predates the camps entirely. In 1942, before his deportation, Frankl was the director of the neurological department at the Rothschild Hospital in Vienna, the only facility still permitted to treat Jewish patients under Nazi rule. And during this period, records indicate that Frankl performed severe medical procedures on suicidal Jewish patients, including cranial trepanation, which means drilling holes into the skull, lobotomies, and high-dose amphetamine injections, without the patient's consent, on people who had attempted suicide. The ethical debate around this is intense and genuinely polarizing, and I want to present both sides clearly. Defenders of Frankl argue you cannot judge these decisions outside of their context. Jewish doctors operating under Nazi rule were working in an impossible nightmare. The argument in Frankl's defense is that he was desperately trying to keep Jewish patients alive, that if he could forcibly treat their suicidal depression through radical neurological intervention, he might keep them off the transport lists to the death camps, extreme battlefield medicine in service of saving lives. Critics see it differently. Historian Günter Bischoff and others argue this constitutes a catastrophic breach of medical ethics regardless of context. And the darker suggestion is that Frankl may have been attempting to ingratiate himself with Nazi authorities. The regime wanted to suppress the wave of Jewish suicides in Vienna. Frankl's experiments to physically stop those suicides could be read as aligning his work with the regime's immediate goals, using vulnerable, unconsenting patients as subjects. I don't think there's a clean resolution to this. It is a profoundly disturbing reality to hold alongside the author of a book about human dignity. And finally, stepping away from history and into the clinical community itself, the most prominent psychological critique comes from Rollo May. May argued that logotherapy flirts dangerously with authoritarianism. His critique focuses on the power dynamic in the therapy room. He observed that the logotherapist, in their zeal to cure, often ends up dictating what the patient's meaning should be, rather than allowing them to discover it organically. And I think that's a real risk. If I walk into a therapist's office completely lost and depressed, and the therapist sits me upright and says, "Here is the meaning of your suffering, here is your path, accept it," that doesn't restore my agency. It replaces my own messy, personal process of self-discovery with someone else's prescribed philosophy. The therapist becomes less of a psychological guide and more of a priest handing down dogma. May felt that while the goal of logotherapy was genuinely noble, the method could circumvent the patient's autonomy entirely, placing the therapist in a position of unchecked moral authority. So how do we hold all of this? Survival bias, historical discrepancies, the ethical nightmare of the Rothschild hospital, clinical authoritarianism. If the foundation has these cracks, do we throw the whole theory out? I don't think so, but I think the honest answer requires us to hold two things at once. The controversies are real. They matter. They demand that we remember psychology is not neutral. Theories are born from complex, traumatized, and sometimes compromised human beings, operating under impossible pressures in impossible circumstances. Frankl was all of those things. But we can evaluate the ideas separately from the man who built them. A framework can contain profound truths while still bearing the historical weight of its creator. We do not have to deify Frankl. Viktor Frankl survived the camps. He rebuilt his life. He wrote this book, and then he spent the next 50 years teaching the same thing, over and over, in lectures and clinics and conversations around the world. That meaning is always available, that no matter what is taken from you, your name, your work, your family, your health, the last human freedom remains, the freedom to choose how you face what happens to you. That is a genuinely extraordinary idea, but I'd be doing you a disservice if I didn't tell you what the book doesn't say. A theory of human resilience built only on the resilient has a blind spot baked into its foundation. There's something quietly uncomfortable in the idea that suffering always contains meaning. Pushed to its limit, told to the wrong person, it can tip into something cruel. It can sound like your pain is a you problem. Frankl didn't intend that. But the idea is sharp enough to cut if you're not careful with it. So here's what I'd suggest. Take the core and keep it. The will to meaning is real. The gap between stimulus and response is real. The three pathways are genuinely useful. Modern research on post-traumatic growth has largely confirmed the direction Frankl was pointing in, even if the clinical method he built around it remains contested. Not every season of your life will be readable as meaningful while you're inside it. Sometimes meaning is something you construct in retrospect, looking back at a hard year from the other side, finally able to see the shape of it. That's not a failure of will, that's just being human. Frankl wrote this book because he believed the West was in a crisis of meaning. Too comfortable, too focused on pleasure and power, and not nearly enough on purpose. He wrote that in 1946. I'll let you decide how relevant that diagnosis feels today. The next time life asks something difficult of you, pause before you ask, why is this happening to me? Ask instead, what is this asking of me? That's a harder question, and it might be the most important one.